I'm going to do a really quick video on tips on how to get your Panhard bar out if it's seized. Here's my Mustang if anybody wants to see it. So we wound up trying to take the Panhard bar out because I wanted to get the rear as low as possible, because we're actually going to weld the diff. I'm probably going to do a video on welding the diff also. This Panhard bar has been on the car since 2015. It's a UPR piece. I really don't blame them for this issue or anything. I've seen this happen with stock Panhard bars too. We're in Maryland and rust is a big issue on the East Coast. So what can happen is the bolt can either rust in there or actually just get seized if the bushing isn't lubed up enough. And I guess if you don't use anti-seize, these will eventually seize up. So then the bolt will get stuck to the inside sleeve of the bushing. It'll basically weld itself on. You can see how gummed up this one looks. You see that there's some rust around here. To get this side out, we used a ball joint tool, which is this one from Harbor Freight. It'll be this Maddox ball joint service kit. We bought this because we want to do a different Hikers Delete on the Skyline, but it came in handy today for this. But this side over here was kind of a big issue. We couldn't really press the bolt from the back side because there's a pocket there. So to get this out, we had to get a little creative and basically just cut everything, which kind of sucks, but you can see that inside sleeve. This was basically welded in there, and it won't come out of that hole because that hole's too small. It's not made for an entire bushing sleeve. And no matter how hard we tried, we could not pull this thing out. Couldn't pry it out. Never wanted to pry with a screwdriver anyway, but we couldn't pry it out. We even had a flat bar to try to pry it out. It just wouldn't go. So to cut it out, you can use a Sawzall, or the other option was to use a right angle grinder. My tool of choice for this was this Milwaukee one. I bought this for sanding down the Skyline a couple weeks ago, and it came in handy for sanding small areas. But you got to get a 3-inch cutoff wheel adapter for this. This fits in there snug. Always inspect your cutoff wheels. Also, you should really wear a face shield with this because there's no kind of guard on here. So if this explodes, it's going to go into your face. So wear a shield, please, or at least safety glasses at minimum if you don't care about your cheeks. But yeah, I'm going to throw a little bit of video in here and probably do a voiceover.
So loosening up the passenger side bolt was easy enough, but you could see that it didn't want to come out. We moved the axle up and down a few times to make sure that there was no tension on the bolt. Sometimes if the axle's too high or too low, it could be potentially putting force on the bolt, and that'll keep it from coming out. But the thing was just seized in there completely. Like I said earlier, the driver's side bolt is even worse to get to. There's no way that you can really press it out from behind unless you had a really big C-clamp and then maybe an extension rod to kind of put pressure on it. I just couldn't figure out a way to get this. Even if I had a slide puller or something, it's kind of hard to get on the head of the bolt. So that's when we started cutting. You could potentially use a Sawzall for this, but you're going to want to use one of those big Diablo blades that are used for cutting heavy metal. I've had luck with them before cutting bolts. It did kind of seem like these bolts were harder material than most bolts that I've cut before, so that's another reason we went with the cutting wheel. We had to cut the bolt in several sections. We cut the head off and then cut the bushing side, then had to get that slice out of the pocket. The pocket did get bent up a little bit. Once we got one piece of the bolt out, we had to get the main part out. So that's when I decided that we needed to burn the bushing. Setting the bushing on fire wound up giving the rest of the bolt enough room to wiggle out. It was still a bit of a pain to get that thing out. I wound up cutting the Panhard bar in half because I figured it would be a little bit easier to get it out. The bushings were already burnt up in it and the adjustment nuts were already locked up, so there was no saving this Panhard bar. Another thing to note is the axle side mount did get pretty bent up, so when we went to put the new Panhard bar in, we had to beat this thing back into shape quite a bit. I think it mostly got deformed from trying to pry the bolt out. Just take note that you don't want to bend this thing too much because the bolt isn't going to be long enough to reach the female threads inside of the axle pocket.
I'm going to blow it out and make a wish. I wish that my goddamn suspension would just come out so I can replace it.
For the passenger side, we use that Harbor Freight ball joint tool. It's used for replacing ball joints normally, but we were able to press the bolt out with this C-clamp. It's just a big C-clamp with a threaded rod on it, and you screw it in, and it just presses the bolt out. We did spray a little bit of PB Blast on the bolt to get it to move a little bit more. Not sure if it even helped or not, but thanks to that Harbor Freight ball joint tool, we were able to get this side out a lot easier than the driver's side.
Thank you. Thank you, Harbor Freight. Alright, didn't even have to set this side on fire. Finally got it out. Anybody want to buy it? Might have to weld it back together. This was a pain in the ass, but this was the only way to do it. And I figured I'd make a video. That way, if anybody else encounters this, you can watch it. My steering rack tips video did pretty well on YouTube, so I figured I'd make another one. We'll probably do a separate one on the lower control arms. And like I said, another video on welding the diff. So that should be within the next week or so, because we got a lot of stuff to do. We're gonna replace that Panhard bar with this nice RTR unit. Seems to be a really nice piece. I haven't even unboxed it yet, but I'm pretty excited about this one. This was about 150 bucks from AmericanMuscle.com. The UPR piece was nice, but it wasn't very adjustment friendly. This is gonna be a lot easier to adjust because you got the turnbuckle right here in the middle. The UPR ones were on the end, and that wasn't very fun to get to. You basically had to drop the bar, spin everything, and lock it up, and it was kind of a pain in the ass. Having this turnbuckle right here is going to make everything a lot easier to do when we're on the alignment rack. It's got these nice fresh bushings. You don't have to grease these. The other issue with the UPR one was that it does have those Zerx fittings where you're supposed to grease them up separate. This is all self-contained, and you don't have to do any kind of maintenance to it, which will be nice. So you can see how you got to adjust this. Got to basically take this lock nut off and spin the entire shaft, which I cut because I wanted to make sure there was no load on it. Another quick note, if you're doing your Panhard bar and it doesn't want to come out, make sure that there's no load on it. If there's load on the Panhard bar, that bolt's not going to want to come out just because it's got pressure on it. But we wound up cutting this just to make sure there wasn't any kind of load on it. Also, it made it easier to pry out. You don't necessarily need to cut yours up, but make sure that there's no load. The whole 3-link setup on these Mustangs is nice and seems to work pretty good for traction, and it's dependable. But with things flexing and moving the whole time, this can weld to the bolt at some point if this doesn't spin enough. And I'm thinking that's what happened with ours between that and the rust. So when you're trying to cut that bolt, you basically want to get the cutting wheel between the bushing and the pocket. It's kind of a pain in the ass, but you're gonna have to do it that way so you can actually get it out. We tried cutting the head off and beating the bolt in, but because it winds up bottoming out on the female side, it didn't really work out that way. So you actually got to get that cutting wheel in the pocket and try not to cut this mount. If you cut this mount, you're gonna need a whole new housing, so don't cut to where this gets sliced or anything. You can pry this out a bit so you can get the cutting wheel in there a little bit easier, but there's not much wiggle room. That's why we wound up setting the bushing on fire, melting it out a little bit, and it gave us a little more room for that cutting wheel. The Sawzall blade would also work. If you do that, I recommend getting one of those thick metal blades. That one's a Diablo. That was pretty dull. That's why we wound up going to the cutting wheel. Cutting wheel was also faster, I think. Those Diablo blades do work really well though. We've cut bolts with them before, but I think that one's just dead. We've used that thing for a lot of cutting over the last couple months. Regular grinder with a full-size cut-off wheel is kind of hard to get in there. That's why I really recommend getting that small setup, especially because these have guards on them usually. This just didn't want to fit in there. It would wind up cutting them out on the axle side, but this was just enough to fit in that pocket. See the size difference. So if your Panhard bar did get seized and you had to cut the bolts, the part number is going to be this, W711504 S439. That's going to be the fatter bolts, just in case you have that issue with your sway bar and links. We stripped one of those bolts out, so that number is W708737 S439. If your nuts were stripped out or something, I think this is like an M, I don't know, it's a big M, whatever the big M size is. We got these at a local Ford part supply place called Packard Norris, so if you're in the Baltimore area, they should have them. This was like $20 of hardware. Probably could have found something at Fastenal maybe for a little bit cheaper, but I really wanted to make sure that we had this tapered, smooth shaft part for the bushings and stuff, so yeah. But yeah, anyway, that's the video. Like I said, just a quick one with some tips. And if you're doing this, be safe and have a great day. Sorry, Anakin, you were supposed to be the chosen one.